There is a version of financial stability that looks secure from the outside and feels unstable from the inside. And that contradiction sits at the center of what many people experience as middle-class life. The income is respectable, the bills are mostly paid on time, the apartment or house appears functional, the job is not necessarily glamorous, but it is steady enough to sustain routine. And from a distance, it can seem as though the hardest part is over. Yet inside that structure, there is often a quiet tension that does not fully disappear, because the system is balanced less on abundance than on continuous flow. Money comes in, money goes out, and what remains is often too small to create real room for error. The trap is not poverty in the traditional sense, nor is it wealth in any meaningful protective sense. It is a condition of appearing economically stable while remaining highly vulnerable to interruptions, delays, and shocks. That condition is what we can call the middle-class liquidity trap. Liquidity sounds like a technical term, and in finance, it usually refers to how quickly an asset can be turned into usable cash without losing much value. But in ordinary life, liquidity is much more personal. It is the difference between having resources and being able to use them when life becomes inconvenient at exactly the wrong moment. A household can have income, retirement balances, home equity, durable possessions, and still suffer from low liquidity if there is not enough available cash to absorb disruption. This is where the trap begins, because modern middle-class life often encourages people to build visible stability while quietly reducing access to flexible money. Income is converted into mortgage payments, car payments, insurance premiums, childcare, subscriptions, tuition, debt service, maintenance, and dozens of recurring commitments that feel manageable only as long as nothing shifts. The household may look solid on paper, but in practical terms, it has become a machine that needs constant feeding. The psychological difficulty is that this machine often feels normal. It feels responsible. It can even feel like progress. Buying a home instead of renting is framed as maturity. Financing a reliable car is framed as necessity. Living in a safer neighborhood is framed as prudence. Paying for enrichment, education, convenience, and quality is framed as caring for the family or investing in the future. None of these choices are automatically irrational. Many are understandable. The problem emerges when each individually reasonable decision adds another fixed obligation, and the combined weight of those obligations quietly eliminates flexibility. The middle-class trap is rarely built through one reckless act. It is usually assembled through a series of socially approved upgrades that convert income into immobility. This is why liquidity matters more than people think. A liquid household can adapt. It can survive a delayed paycheck, a medical bill, a major repair, a temporary drop in income, a family emergency, or a policy change without immediately moving into crisis mode. A low liquidity household cannot absorb these events gracefully, even if its annual income looks healthy. It may own valuable things, but value is not the same as access. A home may contain equity, but equity does not help if the air conditioning fails in July and there is no cash reserve. A retirement account may be growing, but it is not a practical tool for a broken transmission, a legal expense, or a sudden gap between jobs. The trap is not that the middle class owns nothing. The trap is that much of what it owns cannot solve short-term problems without friction, delay, cost, or penalty. That friction changes behavior in profound ways. When people live with low liquidity, even at moderate or high income levels, they begin to make decisions through the lens of maintaining the machine rather than improving their position. They stay in unsuitable jobs because the risk of interruption feels too high. They postpone necessary changes because the margin for transition is too thin. They become highly sensitive to timing because a mismatch of even a few days between cash in and cash out can create stress out of proportion to the actual sums involved. They may avoid opportunities that require temporary sacrifice, not because those opportunities are poor, but because their system cannot tolerate a short period of instability. Over time, this creates a peculiar form of economic paralysis. The household is not collapsing, but it is not free. It is functioning, but only under tightly controlled conditions. That is part of what makes the trap invisible. People imagine financial distress as something dramatic, something associated with default, unemployment, or overt struggle. But many forms of economic pressure are quieter. They show up as constant vigilance, compulsive budgeting, reluctance to rest, inability to take calculated risks, and a low-level fear of anything unpredictable. The household keeps moving, yet the people inside it feel as though they can never fully relax. They are not only paying for life, they are paying for the right to keep their current structure from wobbling. That is a very different emotional experience from actual financial security. If we zoom out, the middle-class liquidity trap makes more sense as a systemic design than as an individual moral failure. Many modern economies reward consumption patterns that are financed over time. Housing is often unaffordable without long-duration debt. Transportation in many places effectively requires a personal vehicle, which means a purchase, financing, insurance, fuel, and repairs. Healthcare can turn routine uncertainty into major financial planning. Education is often treated as both moral duty and economic necessity, pushing families toward expensive zones, supplemental services, and future-oriented spending long before their financial base is truly resilient. Even convenience has become formalized into monthly cost. The result is a household structure where income may rise, but so do pre-committed claims on that income. The person feels upwardly mobile and financially cornered at the same time. This creates an important distinction between wealth and solvency. Wealth is often measured by assets or net worth. Solvency is the ability to meet obligations as they come due. Liquidity sits close to solvency, and it governs day-to-day emotional reality. A family can be technically wealthier than it has ever been and still feel brittle if too much of that wealth is trapped inside slow, inaccessible, or illiquid forms. In that sense, liquidity is not merely a financial ratio. It is a lived sensation of maneuverability. It determines whether a problem can be handled quietly or must be escalated into borrowing, selling, delaying, or panic. That is why two households with similar incomes can feel completely different from the inside. One may have modest visible status but strong liquidity, and therefore more calm. Another may display the full architecture of success and yet feel one disruption away from disorder. Behavioral economics helps explain why this trap is so persistent. Human beings tend to evaluate progress using visible markers. We respond to what can be seen, counted, and socially compared. A larger home, a better school district, a newer car, a well-furnished space, organized family routines, and polished consumption all signal competence. Liquid reserves do not signal much at all. They are quiet, hidden, and often psychologically unsatisfying. A savings account does not announce itself to neighbors. Cash buffers do not create status. In fact, building liquidity can feel like underliving, especially in a culture that treats visible upgrading as proof that one's effort is paying off. That means the very thing that creates resilience is often less emotionally rewarding in the short term than the things that reduce resilience. There is also a subtler psychological mechanism at work. When income rises, people do not simply buy more, they buy certainty, identity, and relief. A better neighborhood is not just a neighborhood. It is a story about safety and belonging. A more expensive car is not just transportation. It is predictability, presentation, and reduced friction. Paid services are not just indulgences. They are time reclaimed from exhaustion. The problem is that relief purchased through recurring cost can become a dependency. Once the household adapts to a new baseline, that baseline starts to feel non-negotiable. The expense ceases to feel optional and becomes part of what it means to function normally. This is how flexibility narrows without anyone consciously intending it. Historically, this dynamic is not new. In many periods of expanding middle-class life, rising income has been accompanied by rising complexity. Households have gained access to better goods, better infrastructure, and better opportunities, but they have also accumulated more points of financial fragility. Industrial households became dependent on wage continuity. Suburban households became dependent on cars, mortgages, and commuting structures. Modern digital households have layered on subscriptions, data costs, financed devices, education platforms, and service ecosystems. Each era changes the form of the obligations, but the pattern is familiar. Stability becomes tied to ongoing participation in a costly system. The more integrated a family becomes into that system, the harder it is to step out without losing more than convenience. This is where the trap becomes deeply psychological. People begin to protect the appearance and continuity of their life, rather than asking whether the structure itself is too rigid. They focus on maintaining monthly compliance. They optimize around deadlines. They become excellent operators of a financially tight system, which can look like discipline from the outside. But this kind of discipline is often reactive rather than strategic. It is discipline in service of survival at a higher aesthetic level. The person may be organized, professional, hardworking, and still caught in a model that converts nearly all effort into maintenance. The machine runs, but it does not create much new freedom. One reason this matters is that low liquidity makes the cost of transitions unusually high. Changing jobs may require waiting for benefits, enduring a gap in pay, moving cities, or carrying uncertainty for longer than the household can tolerate. Starting a business may not be reckless in theory, but it becomes practically inaccessible if there is no buffer for uneven income. Taking time off for caregiving, education, or recovery becomes extraordinarily difficult when every month is already fully allocated. Even leaving a harmful situation, whether personal or professional, becomes more complicated. This is why liquidity is more than cash. It is social and psychological agency. It determines whether choices are real or merely imagined. The middle-class liquidity trap also changes how people interpret emergencies. In a high-liquidity life, a surprise expense is annoying. In a low-liquidity, middle-class life, the same expense can feel like an indictment of the entire system. That is because the system has been tuned too tightly. There is no room for normal randomness. The budget assumes steady conditions, and real life does not provide steady conditions for very long. Cars break, children need things, family members get sick, insurance changes, prices rise, jobs shift, and houses demand maintenance whether the timing is convenient or not. If the structure is built without enough idle space, then ordinary volatility starts to feel catastrophic. The household may not be poor, but it becomes vulnerable to the same emotional dynamics that scarcity creates: short-term thinking, loss aversion, decision fatigue, and chronic vigilance. This vulnerability often leads to a paradoxical response. Instead of simplifying, people sometimes add more. They seek higher income, but do so in ways that come with more stress, more commitments, and more lifestyle expansion. Or they use credit to smooth the discomfort, which preserves the appearance of normal life while transferring the pressure into the future. This is one reason the trap can deepen even when income rises. More money enters the system, but because the system itself remains optimized for immediate outflow, little of that money turns into true liquidity. The household becomes larger, shinier, and harder to maneuver. So what actually breaks the trap is not usually a dramatic act of austerity or a fantasy of sudden wealth. It is a structural shift in what the household is trying to maximize. If the goal remains outward performance, then additional income will tend to be captured by visible improvements and convenience costs. If the goal becomes maneuverability, the decision-making changes. A person begins to ask different questions, not whether this expense is affordable this month, but whether it increases future rigidity. Not whether a payment fits the budget, but whether it narrows options. Not whether an upgrade looks justified, but whether it trades flexibility for image. These questions are less emotionally satisfying in the short run, yet they are far more powerful in the long run, because they move attention from appearances to system design. At a practical level, liquidity is built through boring things that do not photograph well. Cash reserves, lower fixed costs, fewer financed obligations, wider gaps between required spending and take-home income, more conservative assumptions about irregular costs, a smaller appetite for turning every success into a permanent monthly expense. None of this is glamorous, which is precisely why it works. It reduces the number of ways ordinary life can force a household into high-stress behavior. It creates time to think. It reduces dependence on perfect execution. It turns some future emergencies back into manageable inconveniences. But the deeper shift is internal. A household escaping the liquidity trap stops treating income as proof of safety and starts treating flexibility as the real measure of strength. That changes identity. Instead of seeing restraint as deprivation, people begin to see it as retained optionality. Instead of seeing buffers as unused money, they see them as stored stability. Instead of interpreting a lower burden life as a failure to maximize, they begin to understand that freedom often looks less impressive than dependency from the outside. This is one of the more counterintuitive truths about middle-class finance. The life that appears most polished is not always the life with the most room to breathe. Once that becomes visible, the trap is easier to recognize everywhere. It appears in households that cannot withstand 2 missed paychecks despite strong salaries. It appears in families who own appreciating assets but cannot manage a mid-sized repair without debt. It appears in professionals who feel successful and yet cannot imagine taking 6 months to retrain, relocate, recover, or experiment. It appears in people whose lives are full of respectable commitments but empty of financial slack. This is not because they are foolish. It is because modern financial life rewards the accumulation of structure long before it rewards the accumulation of resilience. In the end, the middle-class liquidity trap is not really about class identity at all. It is about the difference between earning enough to maintain a structure and having enough accessible flexibility to shape one. That difference governs the emotional experience of money far more than most visible markers of success. A liquid life is not necessarily luxurious, but it is adaptive. It can bend, it can pause, it can change direction without immediately breaking. A trapped life may look respectable, efficient, even aspirational, but underneath, it remains highly sensitive to disruption because too much of its energy is already spoken for. That is why liquidity changes everything. It transforms money from a stream that must be constantly defended into a tool that can absorb uncertainty. It reduces the pressure to keep performing stability and increases the ability to actually live it. It creates the rarest financial asset of all, which is not status, not scale, and not even high income, but room. Room to think, room to recover, room to choose, room to say no, room to survive transition without panic. And once you understand the trap in those terms, the solution stops looking like upward display and starts looking like strategic breathing space, which is far less glamorous, far more durable, and much closer to what real financial stability has always been.